I would like to start by thanking Thibaut for having me on this Pontic webinars. I'm very happy to be here sharing some very recent results from the Komana excavations. Actually, what I'm going to present tonight is adapted from a recent chapter we submitted to the Archaeology of Anatolia Recent Discoveries, Volume 5, which should be published by the end of this year or early next year. So it's a chapter prepared in collaboration with my colleagues, Max Ritter and Aslan Çivilida. So I'm also presenting them or representing them here for this talk. So the ancient site of Komana is located in the central Pontus region next to the Iris River. For those of you who are not very familiar with its location, it's in the province of Tokat. Its strategic position in the eastern extension of the fertile Dazimonitis plain on the road from ancient Dazimon, Tokat, to Neo-Caesarea, Niksar, benefited the site economically through its extensive lifespan. The roads reaching the Black Sea coast through Amasya in the north, crossroads for many important routes, and through Neo-Caesarea in the Lycus Valley in the northeast, provided Komana access to the sea, while a possible route towards Sebastea, Sivas in the south connected the site with Cappadocia and Cilicia further south. In addition to its well-connected position within an interrelated settlement system, Komana prospered due to the rich resources available in terms of agriculture and metallurgy. The site was most renowned under Mithridates VI, who lived actually between 120 and 63 BCE, as it was a prominent sanctuary dedicated to the goddess Ma. But the origins of this sacred site extended well before the Hellenistic period, possibly dating back to the Hittites. Previously, in a chapter written for Understanding Transformations, exploring the Black Sea region and northern central Anatolian antiquity, published in 2021, I discussed the urbanization and Romanization processes at Komana during the 2nd and 3rd centuries with the help of inscriptions discovered among spolia during excavations and a partial statue of one Euergetes built into a later fortification. At the time, the archaeological evidence on the Roman period at Komana was more or less limited to these finds, in addition to a few out-of-context coins. The majority of the information is otherwise derived from ancient sources such as Strabo, Plutarch, Cassius Dio, and Komana was mostly discussed as a Hellenistic period sanctuary dedicated to Ma. The sources informed us that although Komana was geographically part of the provinces organized and reorganized by the Romans, the sanctuary continued its role as a religious center with expanding and shrinking territory through the Roman periods. Before the systematic archaeological explorations at Komana, which were initiated by myself in 2004, the only testimony to the Roman habitation in the area was 2 inscription fragments built into the foot of a bridge that once crossed Yeşilırmak, and 3 pieces of an architrave at Tokat Museum, which were carried from near an old bridge. The bridge connected the east bank of the river with the multi-layered settlement hill named Hamamtepe, in modern day Gümenek, and you see the hill on the left, and you see where the bridge was on the right. Today there's a small a mini dam construction or water regulator at the place of the bridge. The inscriptions built into the bridge were dated to 160 CE and bore the name of the settlement as Hierokaisarion Komaneon, and you have seen these inscriptions here. A name we also come across on coins minted under Septimius Severus, and the architraves bear a dedicatory inscription to Trajan and date to after 116 CE. The excavations at Hamamtepe a central mound in the Yeşilırmak Valley, have concentrated on the northeast section of the site in the last 3 years, so between 2020 and 2022. Mostly because the bedrock, which projects at the center of the hill, seems to sharply drop towards this part of the mound, providing opportunities to dig into earlier levels. Indeed, as we dug deeper, we reached earlier occupation levels, which were dated to the Roman period, 2nd through 5th centuries, late Iron Age, early Hellenistic period, between 4th and 2nd centuries BCE, and early Bronze Age or late Chalcolithic, early Bronze Age between 3000 and 2700 BCE. In 2020, we decided to study the Roman levels at the site more closely in order to build a reliable chronology and reveal the characteristics of the site under Roman rule. This objective had already materialized with the exceptional finds of armory in 2021 in the midst of a burnt context. Although the excavations were conducted in a very narrow section at the eastern end of an excavation grid, just here in a very narrow area, the potential became immediately apparent. In the following year, this burnt building, as well as other earlier and later buildings, were uncovered, largely contributing to the goals of our excavations. Before describing the Roman levels, a brief introduction to the Roman period at Komana, as we know from the literary sources, is necessary. Komana was a sanctuary, as I mentioned earlier, dedicated to Ma, a warlike Anatolian goddess. Strabo relates that the sanctuary was under the control of a priest who had a critical position, in fact, second in rank to the king, within the Hellenistic kingdom of the Mithridates. According to him, there was a second sanctuary of Ma at Cappadocia, at Shar, and the Pontic Komana was a smaller version of it. The sanctuary prospered especially due to the biannual festivals honoring the goddess, but also because it had a very fertile area under its control. The Hellenistic sanctuary has been widely discussed in previous publications by myself as well as others, therefore I will not be going into details here, especially because our archaeological finds represent a later period and certainly a transformed image of the site. So Pontus was reorganized under Pompey after it was taken from Mithridates VI so that it could be administered according to the Roman standards of provincial administration. The new province of Pontus at Bithynia was established, reaching from Bosporus to Pharnakia and bordering Cappadocia to the south. Yet Komana remained beyond the confines of the new province, as you see here with the white borders marked. In the 150 years following Caesar's defeat of Pharnaces at Zila in 47 BCE, Pontus expanded to include neighboring regions or shrank due to renewed arrangements. Within this dynamism, Komana had its own share. Pompey transformed the sanctuary to a principate with Archelaus appointed as the chief priest. Appointments of various priests by Rome continued well into the 1st century CE. Only in 34-35 CE, Komana received the status of a polis and was integrated to a Roman province, Galatia, in the section of Pontus Galaticus. During the reign of Trajan, between 107 and 113 CE, two previously separated sections, Pontus Galaticus and Pontus Ptolemaiacus, were united to form inland Pontus, Pontus Mediterraneus, now subjected to the governor of Cappadocia. Komana became one of the 6 cities of this new section, or koinon, along with Amasea, Neocaesarea, Zela, Sebastopolis, and Sebastea. The reforms of Diocletian dismantled this administrative arrangement, and henceforth, Komana was among the cities in the new province Pontus Ptolemaiacus that took up the name of the former section, with capital at Neocaesarea, including Trebizond, Kerasus, and Polemonion. Komana Pontica remained rather powerful and partially autonomous, as much as it was under the Hellenistic kings, throughout the Roman period, while at Komana Cappadocia, the power of the priest decreased already in the 1st century CE. Romans identified Ma as Bellona, later Virtus, and were mostly attracted to the exotic features of the cult, such as a state of trance, fortune-telling, and self-injury. The cult was introduced to Rome during the campaigns of Sulla against Mithridates VI and shared a temple with Mars in the Urbs Aeterna. The excavation results from 2022 indicate a very dynamic settlement history during the Roman period. While we do not have evidence for the temple depicted on Roman coins or any other building that could have belonged to the sanctuary described by Strabo, we have at least 3 different phases of occupation on Hamam Tepe that date between the 2nd and 4th to 5th centuries. The architectural stratigraphy is very complicated on Hamam Tepe, regardless of the period, since it's a multi-layered mound with layers of architecture practically lying one on top of another with minimum soil deposition, if any. This is the case also for the Roman period buildings, which complicates the dating of each level. The layers of architecture not only overlap, but also interlock because earlier walls were reused to create new spaces within the span of a couple hundred years. In the midst of this confusing picture, we were able to identify 3 different levels of architecture. They are presented below from the earliest to the latest. In order to orient the reader, a brief settlement, or not reader, but in this case, the listeners, a brief settlement history on Hamam Tepe is presented as an introduction to the Roman levels at the site. Hamam Tepe, as I mentioned earlier, is a mound formation over a rock outcrop and constitutes the main excavation area at Komana. While there are several sections of the hill where excavations continue, the material presented here all derives from the central section, which we call HTP-01. The site itself spreads across the eastern section of a fertile plain called Dazimonitis, Kazova today, in ancient sources, a plain watered by one of the 2 largest rivers of north-central Anatolia, the Yeşilırmak River, Iris. Hamam Tepe must have been repeatedly used due to its strategic location in the middle of the plain, both commanding the road from Dazimon to Neo-Caesarea and providing a refuge from the flood waters as well as enemy attacks. The outcrop was used as a foundation for fortifications for several centuries, starting as early as the 7th century. The fortifications were reused during the Danishmend Selçuk period with repeated repairs and alterations. An earlier fortification or a circumference wall has also been unearthed, which still awaits dating, and that's this wall you see here. The uppermost section of the mound was settled during the Ottoman period and was probably a neighborhood of the village of Kumanat. Later, the village must have moved to a higher location to the west. Ruins of a village still exist at that location, where a few shepherds reside with their flocks. The Ottoman village on Hamam Tepe was abandoned peacefully, indicated by a lack of material culture in buildings, which disintegrated to their foundations as a result of natural processes. The Ottoman village sits on top of a Danishmend Selçuk period settlement, and during this period, the late Roman, early Byzantine fortifications were reused to enclose a production facility characterized by small adjacent units with several thunder ovens, storage, and garbage pits. This complex must have been built rather hastily with whatever construction material was available on the hill and functioned for about 100 years between the end of the 12th and the early 14th century. This industrial area must have been part of a larger settlement beyond the limits of Hamam Tepe. There are ruins of a hammam, a mausoleum, an unidentified public building on the northern slopes of the hill, and several bridges crossing the Yeşilırmak River and its tributaries in the immediate vicinity of Hamamtepe. The Danishmend Selçuk settlement was built immediately on a Middle Byzantine cemetery with two adjacent chapels. Parts of these chapels were also used for the workshops, while the graves were, for the most part, spared from destruction by the shallow fortifications of the newly built structures. By the end of the excavation season in 2022, around 150 graves had been excavated. At the time when the two chapels were built and the cemetery expanded around them, the latest level of the Roman settlement, 4th, 5th century, was destroyed. The chapel constructions resulted in the demolishing of the mortared walls of a series of houses, the remains of which are still visible in the foundations of the chapels. Here you see walls going right into the chapels. Below this level, we could identify at least 3 other levels of Roman period buildings, which are described in detail now. So on the northern section of HTP-01, excavations revealed this complex and prominent system of buildings with context dating from the 2nd through the 5th century. The building complexes all lean against a very thick stone and concrete wall, which could have been part of a fortification system, and that's this wall, destroyed a little bit here, but very prominent, sturdy wall. This wall is yet to be dated, however, it's still possible to understand its phasing in relation to the other walls in the vicinity. The earliest phase is the so-called sword building phase. And it is represented by a fragmentary piece of a continuous wall around 15 meters long in slightly northwest-southeast direction. This wall intersects with 2 other walls to the east, one of which is built of mud brick, and this is the mud brick wall. The main axis and the second intersecting wall are built of rubble and concrete. Remains of stucco suggest that at least one side of these walls were plastered, and it's this side which is the interior of the building. The mud brick wall is a rather peculiar element and could have been built as a secondary intervention, and this is the mud brick wall. There's a pipe system, parts of which you see here, going through the shorter walls, following the line of the longer northwest-southeast wall. The terracotta pipe is visible at 3 places, suggesting a continuous sewage system. Although these walls are heavily disturbed by later interventions, the area presents one of the most secure archaeological contexts so far for the Roman period. The eastern side of the building suffered a fierce fire, creating an environment in which all remains were destroyed by fire, but also preserved as a result. The finds point to a domestic context which is far from being an ordinary house. Several iron swords, a dagger, an axe, personal ornaments such as cloak pins and a bronze coin hoard of at least 42 coins suggest that this was the house of a high-ranking soldier, or, less likely, of a gladiator. In addition to these extraordinary finds, pottery, animal bones, and carbonized plants were found. Among the plants are wheat, as you see on the right, almonds, walnuts, almonds on the left, olive pits, and chickpeas. On the floor of the burnt room, remains of textiles, at least 1 cloak, which was found together with one of the pins, sheets of parchment, and the frame of a wax tablet were also found. The ceramics from the secure layers include around 135 pieces. Among them are bowls, dishes, baking dishes, jugs, beakers, and 2 amphora handles. Krzysztof Domzalski dated the assemblage to the 2nd, 3rd centuries. However, further study is planned for 2023. Only a fraction of the related coin finds, at least 54 in total, could be examined in depth during the campaign, as many were discovered after Max Ritter had already left the site. They will therefore be studied in the coming season. All these coins are of basic metal, but 2 were thinly coated with silver. The coin assemblage, quite substantial in terms of size alone, was characterized by its uniformity, which almost reminds of a saving hoard. Moreover, several of the coins had slight use wear, indicating that they had not been in circulation for long. Among the most conspicuous finds were an Antoninus of Empress Herenia, provincial issues from Pontus Mediterraneus in the name of Severus Alexander, Valerian, and Gallienus, and coins struck in Caesarea and Tomis under Gordian III. There were many other 3rd century provincial coins minted in North Asia Minor, which still need to be studied in more detail to identify the minting authorities. However, based on the closed assemblage of coins, the context can already be assigned a provisional and approximate date of around the late 250s or 260s, sometime in the reigns of Valerian or his son Gallienus. The artifacts, as well as the organic remains, are being studied in depth and will constitute the core of another publication. Soil samples collected from different parts of the context promise discovery of further botanical remains. The results obtained will help clarify the anthropogenic factors involved in the sedimentary formation processes of what seems to be a destruction context, identify economic activities related to the excavated building, determine the reasons for the fire, and create a template for future comparative matrices from different settlement layers at the site. The second level, above the burnt building, is the so-called basilical building. It is characterized by a very well-built structure, possibly the most sturdy of all Roman buildings discovered so far. This building also leans on the thick wall on the north and has the most potential to be contemporaneous with it. The excavated part of the building is probably only a section of a much larger structure or a building complex expanding towards the south and west. The walls are built of mortar and stone, and their robust construction enabled them to survive at a considerable height. Until today, despite many interventions. The plan, which is oriented slightly northeast-southwest, resembles that of a basilica with a main rectangular central space and 2 narrower spaces on either side. The length of the building is 16 meters by 14, and the eastern walls were preserved to serve as part of a later building, while the 2 western walls were raised to the ground to open space for possibly a courtyard in the following period. The thick wall in the north was cut at one point to create an entrance here into the building from the north, but it's difficult to establish at what stage this renovation was done. We would like to suggest that it was opened up in the succeeding period. The archaeological context in and around this building are unfortunately very complicated due to 2 subsequent Roman levels. The area went through substantial transformation and witnessed several centuries of habitation, which resulted in the destruction of floors and original contexts. Not only the 2 succeeding Roman levels, but also the construction of the 2 chapels and the graveyards, which expanded all the way here, in the 11th to 12th centuries must have destroyed archaeological layers as well as the buildings, especially the western side of the building. The ceramics have been broadly dated by Domzalski to between 1st and 3rd centuries. Given the coin evidence, the relevant layers probably date from the end of 4th century, as they contain bronze coins struck in the name of Galerius, and that's the second one. The A was from the first group, the burnt building. B is from the second group, this basilical building phase, maybe. So the relevant layers probably date from the end of the 4th century, as they contained bronze coins struck in the name of Galerius, Theodosius I, and Honorius. The aisled whole plan of this building, its sturdy construction, and its immediate relationship to the thick fortification wall in the north may suggest that this building was either a public building the function of which is difficult to guess for now, or part of a military settlement, maybe a castrum. We may be deceived by the fragmentary nature of the plan. This structure may very well be a section of a larger grid-planned building complex, in which case the interpretation of it as a basilica plan would be incorrect. The building above this so-called basilica complex, basilica building, is the residential, what we call the residential quarter. The following two levels on top of the basilical level are built using the readily available walls of Rome II, which is the basilica. The primary building was what we called Rome III, and you see here in orange, while Rome IV, which I will show in a minute, was merely a renovation of it. During the beginning of this phase, the existing building, Rome II, was transformed into a house of considerable size, 24 by 17 meters, as preserved. It must have been during this period when a door was opened through the thick northern wall. This door led to an open space, possibly an open courtyard, where the western walls of Rome II, that were creating the basilical plan, were raised to provide space for this courtyard, while on the right-hand side, the basilica, the walls of the previous building level was preserved. On the west, on the right side, as you look at the image, once entered into the building through the door on the north, there was a subsidiary space, on the left, with a door opening to the east. On the right-hand side, east, the eastern aisle of the basilical building was preserved. The building was enlarged towards the east. The southeastern corner of the trench was unexcavated here. So the continuity of the building in that section is unclear, but two more spaces may be identified. The southwestern corner of the house was destroyed during the construction of the main and the northern aisles of the chapel, as well as the graves on this side. Nevertheless, another partial space is identified on this section. The destruction to the west of the main area is even more substantial, making it very difficult to read the full plan. During the excavations in 2016, a large mortar and a small pitos in the spaces to the west, and three much larger pitoi between two spaces described above were discovered, suggesting a domestic context, possibly a storage area. The layers confining the pitoi had roof tiles on the upper levels, followed by a soil with abundant organics indicated by the color. It also contained a considerable amounts of shells. The dating for the pottery varied between early, late Roman periods, confirming the heavy intervention in the area. These pitoi could be from the secondary use of the building, which I'm going to describe just now, but further study on the pottery and coinage is certainly necessary. So during the final stage of the Roman occupation, which is Rome IV, what we call Rome IV, the residential quarter went through significant rebuilding, especially within this courtyard area. The open space, which was identified as a courtyard in the previous period, was divided into smaller spaces by dry walls. These dry walls contained spolia from a single building. The building from which the stones came must have been a monumental public building, since the stones used in the walls were chipped off from large marble blocks. At places, moldings of the original building are recognizable. Same stones were used to strengthen the former concrete walls in the northeast-southwest direction, these walls, where pieces were once again set into concrete. A close study of the architectural spolia could reveal the type of the building these came from, as well as its date. At any rate, an approximate date is provided by a coin dating to the early part of Justinian's reign, which evinces occupation of the area well into the 6th century. In the new plan, a hallway, maybe a vestibulum, was created. The room to the west remained in use, but a very small area, almost like a niche, was added between that room and the hallway with the use of stones and mud. Right across the northern entrance, two additional rooms, one L-shaped and one rectangular, were created, and the southern and eastern sections of the house were divided into small rooms, as you see here. The L-shaped area was once again divided to create a tiny space. There was a separation. Here, maybe a latrina. The easternmost room of room 3, here, was cut off from the western section by blocking its entrance right here. In this room, several pitoi with stone slab lids were found within an ashy context. In this room, several pitoi with stone slab lids were found. In addition to the pitoi, there was found a substance which is known to have traditionally been used to smear the interiors of or seal the lids of ceramic jars in Tokat region. In this case, a similar use may be suggested for sealing the pitoi. A bronze, maybe a bread stamp, was also discovered by the pitoi. Roman and Byzantine stamps have, of course, been discovered in excavations and are today present in museum collections, and examples are made of various materials such as clay, bronze, wood, etc., have different forms and have either inscriptions or images. And they were used to stamp a variety of things such as amphorae, bricks, or bread. The Komana stamp is made of bronze, is in the shape of a foot, and bears the name Nikandros. The find location makes it more likely that it was used on bread. The finds from this room suggested that this space could have been used either as a kitchen, kulina, or a pantry during this phase. A very large pile of broken pieces of stones was discovered just outside this room to its south. This space could either have been a courtyard within the building, further excavation is necessary, or exterior of the building. The pile of stones also contained a large number of shells. Both the way this pile was deposited, it was really a pile, and its contents suggested that this could have been brought here and stored for construction purposes. The stones and the shells could have been used as material for some kind of a non-figurative floor mosaic. The house had at least 10 rooms with sizes ranging between 6 meters squares and 22 meters squares. There are two kinds of deposits in these buildings, which I will not go into details, but in terms of periods, the related coin finds range from the High Hellenistic, 2nd century BCE, with issues from Kales in Bithynia and Smyrna, Ionia, imperial coins of the 2nd and 3rd century CE, and a Byzantine class B folis, early 11th century, to several Selçuk coins, 12th century. What is more, a Byzantine lead seal of a certain Maria of the 1st century was also in this deposit. Since the deposit is reflective of the most conspicuous cultural levels of Komana, the date of this context remains unclear. The mixed nature of the context clearly manifests the disturbance of these buildings by the chapels and the graves, as well as sporadic garbage pits of the Selçuk phase. So if we bring all this together, what have we got here during the Roman period? Well, the Roman period buildings on Hamamtepe are represented only partially, as you have seen for now, and therefore any suggestion regarding their function and actual scale will only be hypothetical. However, a quick survey of the military, urban, and domestic contexts of Roman Asia Minor, the nature of the discoveries, and the location and history of Komana encourages one to assess the present finds regardless of their partial nature. The most intriguing context among the Roman levels is certainly the 3rd century burnt building, the so-called sword building. The 3rd century is recognized as a period of crisis across the Roman Empire, following a more or less unified and stable period during which the administrative, economic, and military institutions stood firmly with cities prospering under aristocracies between the establishment of the empire and the 230s. Changes in the civilian administration, as well as in the nature of the military presence in the provinces, took place starting in the mid-3rd century. The economic decline necessitated a more rigorous approach to tax collection, for which the military was put to duty in an attempt to centralize the collection of taxes. Military personnel became more visible in urban contexts across Asia Minor, suggesting that the army was utilized to secure peace and order. Examples come from Erciyas and Pisidian Antioch. Their presence in cities, however, brought further suffering as we hear stories of extortion and oppression. Another reason for decline in the 3rd century was the widespread brigandage, especially in Cilicia, Pisidia, Isauria, and Lycia. The extent of such unrest is not well understood for the northern parts of Asia Minor, as it only clearly surfaces in the 6th century, exemplified in Hadrianopolis. Internal strife and several usurpation attempts by rival emperors was coupled by inroads by Goths and Persian Sassanids during the mid-3rd century. While the Goths devastated the northern and western parts of Anatolia, the Sassanids attacked the east and the south. Rome's eastern defenses collapsed, and several deficiently fortified cities in western Anatolia were sacked. As a consequence, many Anatolian cities built new fortifications in an attempt to defend themselves. The fate of Komana amidst these disturbances is not clear because there is no written or archaeological evidence so far. While Komana assumed an urban character already in the 1st century CE, as evidenced by one particular inscription erected in honor of a gladiator and a partial statue of an Euergetes, as I have shown you earlier, the settlement must have certainly had a continuing rural character with its extensive farmlands spreading across the Dasmonitis Valley. Mitchell argues that the Anatolian countryside, for the most part, was unaffected by these internal and external disturbances, or at least they did not care much about the shifting powers. It would be worthwhile to investigate this claim for Komana in the future. The sword building could provide significant information on the mid-3rd century at Komana, especially if excavations could continue in the coming years. The building itself is only partially preserved, so has very little to contribute in terms of its architecture. However, the military nature of the finds may add to the discussion about the involvement of military personnel in maintaining order and collecting taxes during the crisis period in Asia Minor. It would be a long shot to suggest a military character for the site with such little evidence, and the coins rather represent an assemblage worthy of a provincial town. So one suggestion would be that this house belonged to one of those military officials appointed to collect taxes or impose order at Komana and its surroundings. Identifying the function of the subsequent level, which we call the basilical building, is even harder because of the very mixed contexts discovered during excavations. Its robust construction is one of its most significant features. The plan, once again partial, indicates that it could have been a civic or military building, or maybe part of a castrum. Its close relationship to the fortification also supports its identification as a military building. The fortification represents a significant building program on its own. It could have been built just before or around the same time as the basilical building, and may be a testimony to the reflections of the unrest in Asia Minor. A house was built on top of the basilical building. Substantial changes were made in the plan of the former building to create a plan with an open courtyard and modest spaces around it, which was later complicated even further with additional walls to create a multitude of spaces. Although there's so much destruction by the subsequent levels, it's very hard to read the full plan and identified rooms with entrances or thresholds. The small amount of information suggests that this context was not one of the elite domestic settings, because it lacks many of the elements one would expect from an elite house, such as a peristyle or colonnades, mosaic or stone-paved floors, frescoes, water elements, substantial spaces that differ from one another in terms of size, decoration, and form, as we know from the well-published examples from Ephesus, Sagalassos, Sardis, Aphrodisias, Santos, and Zeugma. Examples of such elite houses were also discovered in northern Anatolia, examples from Pompeiopolis and Hadrianopolis. Here I present. But the modest scale, the unpretentious plan, construction techniques, and the finds of the house at Komana suggest that this was not a residence, possibly of an affluent household. Similar modest houses from late antiquity were found in the Troas, in Lycia, Pisidia, and Cilicia. The daily ceramics, the pitoi, and animal bones recovered from these contexts support the domestic identification of the building. We would like to propose an alternative identification of this building as a mansio. A mansio is an official road station along the cursus publicus for lodging state officials and army commanders overnight. With Neo-Caesaria's increasing importance in the region as the capital of Pontus Mediterraneus, Komana's position on the major road reaching from Sebastopolis, continuing towards here from Sebastopolis, continuing towards the northeast, must have been strengthened. There was a bridge dating to the post-2nd century crossing the Iris River right where the main hill is. The location must be suitable for a crossing, since also during the Seljuk and Ottoman periods, there were bridges at this location. Komana may very well have become a road station during this period between Dazimon and Neo-Caesarea, providing traveling officials a rest stop where there was abundance of water, food, and grazing land for the horses. Only 2 mansiones have so far been identified in Asia Minor, one at Burnaz in the Gulf of Iskenderun, and another at Döşemeboğazı in the Taurus Mountains in Pisidia. The rectangular plan of the mansio at Döşemeboğazı, with a courtyard surrounded by independent rooms, resemble Rome III, but certainly a lot more evidence is necessary to support such a proposition. Mitchell and Kolb are both cautious about identification of such buildings as mansio, since not all could have been official way stations of the imperial postal transport system. Others could have offered accommodation commercially. The interpretations proposed here for the Roman level buildings all need to be revisited in the coming years following further excavations, but this kind of an exercise is certainly useful, especially in reformulating research questions for the fieldwork. And I hope that this talk or your questions and discussions following this talk will also be helpful for us in formulating our research questions. Thank you very much for your patience.